We peek into the war chest of Illinois campaigns. That's next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Ray Long, State House reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Ray, glad you're here.
Good to be here, Jamey.
And Bruce Rushton, staff writer for Illinois Times. Bruce, glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks.
This week we saw candidates for state office disclose their fundraising reports. We saw a lot of interesting things come out. Ray, can you give us a little overview of what folks are looking at, what races people are focusing on?
Well, sure. What we're seeing here is the mounting amount of dollars that Bruce Rauner is pulling together here for his GOP race for governor. Of course, the other Republicans that are running against him are Kirk Dillard, a senator from Hinsdale. We have Dan Rutherford, a former senator, state senator, and now the treasurer of Illinois, running. Brady in the Senate now too, and he was the guy last time. So the way it's shaken out here is that the three people who are in office are not able to raise the money. And Rutherford has raised about $1 million. The other two are way behind. And those are kind of how the polls are shaken out too. Right now we've seen big lead by Rauner, who's spending everything as fast as he can bring in. And he's brought in, what is it, $3 or $4 million, and he's spending it fast, and he's turning out all these ads that we're all seeing all over the place. Nobody else is getting ads on, so he's rising in the polls. It's kind of like the Blagojevich effect, where you pour in the money, you pour in as much as possible, and you get your message out and define yourself, and nobody else has been able to get any money or ads out there to define him. So we are in the midst of this time where Rutherford with $1 million is the only one who's really positioned right now to really put anything in the last few weeks here, and the campaign is sneaking up here before too long. We're going to have that election.
Well, and as Ray said, Rauner is kind of spending that money as soon as he gets it in the door. He's bragged that he can raise basically an infinite amount of money for this campaign. He's shaping his message. Bruce, what is his message? What is he spending all this money on?
His message is, I'm not a politician. You know, I'm a rich guy, and so he makes no bones about that. And you know, there's still 2 months left here. I mean, it's not just, there's still some time here. And, you know, there's some signs. I mean, the debate that took place today between the gubernatorial front runners, well, they're all front runners at this point, so to speak, but the gubernatorial Republican gubernatorial candidates, I mean, it was, what was it, beat on Brucey Day or something, whatever it was. I mean, they were just rare. And you know, to be in point of fact, he does have a couple of cracks that have shown up. I mean, there's his statement on the minimum wage. That's certainly not going to be helpful to him, I think. I think Bernie Schoenberg had a really good story in today's paper about inconsistent statements that Rauner's made regarding, quote unquote, clouding his daughter into a school up in Chicago. Rauner had said, I never spoke to Arne Duncan about this. Arne Duncan was then the head of Chicago schools and is now U.S. Secretary for Education. He said categorically, Bernie's got it on tape, I never spoke to Arne Duncan about this. Now Rauner is saying, I did speak to Arne Duncan about this. Now, whether you can shape that sort of a thing and craft it, it's something to work with, you know, but because it's not central, so, you know, the central point of this is still, I clouded my daughter in, big deal. But if they can say something about, hey, here around the edges here, we got a little bit of stuff to make us wonder about this candidate. Also now they're starting to try to tie him to Blagojevich via Stu Levine, and that was something that's been around, I think, this wasn't invented yesterday, but now you're having other candidates. I think Dillard may have been the one that turned the heat up on that today. And so part of it smacks of desperation. You know, on the other hand, perhaps this is a crucible that he needs to go through to convince the powers that be in the Republican Party that he's a viable candidate come fall. So.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because he even gave that glorious line, beat up on Brucey Day or whatever, and it was just the kind of thing that you might go 30 debates and not have one that good pop out at you. But Rauner is starting to feel some heat, and I think the inconsistencies here that Bruce is talking about can really weigh on a candidate, and that can develop a theme of its own. So he'll have to raise more money now to counteract all these things. The thing that Bruce was talking about with the federal minimum wage, first he says, well, I'm for lowering it. But then he says, I'm for raising it. And then, you know, you find all these inconsistent quotes that he's made around the state. And then you come and find this thing about Arne Duncan, you find other things. He's developing his own theme here. No wonder he didn't want to take a position earlier, because he takes a position all over the place. And now you got to wonder if he's in a position himself where he is, you know, hurting himself by just opening his mouth at any time. You see why he didn't earlier.
Well, I mean, I think right now, I think that it's controllable. I mean, the question is that we're still pretty early, and these are still, you know, what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen next week, and I think that might explain perhaps why you've got candidates like Dillard, for example. On paper, he doesn't have a chance, but we still got 2 months left. Anything could happen, and so, you know, I think that if I was in the place of these candidates, you know, such as Dillard, who, you know, really hasn't been able to get any kind of traction, you know, money-wise, he does have a block of voters that are devoted to him, and you know, as this plays out, could some of these candidates drop out? You know, I think that's something to really watch here. Depending on what Rauner does, we could, I think, see maybe some folks dropping out and some coalescing. So I think it's going to be very interesting.
All of these things are building up here. You know, a lot of us saw Blair Hull rise, spend $33 million in a U.S. Senate race. Then when his court file came open, he sank like a rock, and somebody who was kind of marking time in the back, Barack Obama, suddenly rises up with well-timed ads. So you see people like Rutherford, he has $1 million sitting there. If he times that right, he might be able to get a surge at the right time.
Do you think, Ray, we've seen, you know, union groups fund some attacks on Rauner? They opted not to support anyone in the primary. Do you think they may regret that? Do you think they can get done what they want to get done with just opposing ads, or might it have been a better tactic to pick someone to back?
Yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough. But one of the things that plays in Illinois is when people really attack hard. We saw that back in the George Ryan, Glenn Pichard race, where they were hammering the Democrats. Speaker Michael Madigan, the chairman of the party, was backing these ads that talked about the 6 kids that died in a van crash. Not directly because Ryan had something to do with it, but they were able to show that, or allege that he had created an atmosphere that was loosey-goosey enough that bad commercial driver's licenses could be passed out. And then we find out that the driver of the truck had a license that he got through a bribe. So, you know, those kinds of things resonated. Those were driving numbers down, but then there was such an uproar about it because the whole issue had not played out that Democrats pulled back, and when they pulled back on those ads, the numbers for Pichard were not rising as quickly. So negative attacks do work, so that may be the way they have to go. Barack Obama was able to rise up with less negative attacks after the Blair Hull debacle, because he was just positioned at the right time to get that name idea out, and that really helped him.
Well, and Kirk Dillard has kind of sold himself as maybe the candidate whose turn it is, or sold himself as having competency, having served under Jim Edgar. Are you surprised that his numbers, those fundraising numbers, are where they are?
Yeah, and I think it's a real mystery, but I think what is going on there is Kirk is suffering because he didn't beat Brady the last time. He lost by about 200 votes in the primary last time. And so when he comes to people and says, can you help me with money, he's feeling a couple of fronts. One, well, you couldn't beat Brady last time. And two, you know what, we're going with Rauner this time. And a lot of the money that has gone from the big wealthy business folks, it's now going to Rauner this time too.
Well, and the big question mark with Bill Brady for Republican voters is probably, what would you do differently this time around to beat Pat Quinn? Bruce, do you feel like he's answering that question? How does Brady get past that?
I don't know that he can get past that. I mean, I don't know what's really changed in the landscape here between, Quinn versus Brady in the last 4 years. And I think that is the question. It's like, well, you couldn't do it before. What makes you think you can do it now? I think it's a viable question. I think that I think a lot of folks probably think this. If I'm Quinn, that Rauner's the guy I don't want to face, and so I can see. I think the concern again here is that these cracks are showing. Can he stand up? If he can't, then I think that Rutherford is probably the go-to guy, strictly because these other two already have past histories. I mean, 4 years can make a world of difference, but in this case, for both of them, I don't see that anything's changed. I think that they're going to be seen perhaps as yesterday's news, and Rutherford is the comer.
Well, and Rutherford is, the next candidate that we're seeing with the highest level of fundraising. But Ray, what else does he have to offer?
Well, he does have the ability, and that he touts, to get votes in the city of Chicago. He has tried to make inroads on that, and he chose Steve Kim as his lieutenant governor. At least I remember that one, huh? And so, so there you see that he is trying to also cut into that idea that Chicago is an ethnic town, and there is a degree of diversity that's in Chicago that Chicagoans appreciate, and he's hoping that a ticket like that can help him cut into the city again.
And looking forward to the general election, if Bruce Rauner isn't the candidate, there's some interesting campaign finance rules that have gone into place that could really hurt the person who is the candidate if it's not Bruce Rauner. Ray, can you tell us a little bit how that would work?
Yeah, there's a variety of things that are out there. One of the issues here about the funding is that's what you're getting at here, the way it's funded.
Yeah, so there are limits on what candidates can take in as far as donations go, but since Bruce Rauner has spent so much of his own money, those limits have been lifted in the primary for Democrats and Republicans alike. So Pat Quinn is kind of sitting back quietly, raking in those big donations while all these guys are fighting it out.
Right, and that's exactly the situation. And Jamey, you outlined it well, but what we see here is that Quinn can pack it in now, and all these other guys are, spending on each other, trying to beat each other up. The only person who looks viable to be able to raise money against Quinn would be Rauner under this circumstance. Then when that door closes after the primary, the lid goes back on to the campaign money, so their limits are going to be in place. Quinn is going to raise as much as he can before those limits slam him down. The others, if it's not Rauner, will go in with depleted war chests. They may not be able to make up the kind of money and time that they need to take on Quinn.
Of course, the thought there is, the Republican Party could always spend enough money to take those caps off again to help that candidate out. And, we're going to see probably a lot of outside spending coming in from PACs and national groups. Bruce, what do you think the role is going to be of super PACs, outside money, and going into just the gubernatorial race?
I wouldn't be concerned about a lack of money in a gubernatorial race in Illinois. I don't think that where there's a will, there's a way, and I think that's true not just in Illinois, but we've seen that on the federal level. Whatever sorts of limits, and they are there. There's ways around them, and if this is seen, I think, as a close race, and I think it could be a very close race. I mean, I was reading somewhere, I forget the source, but Quinn is one of the most unpopular governors in the entire nation. The only reason, well, perhaps one of the few reasons that he can count that he's in the governor's mansion is that Illinois is such an overwhelmingly Democratic state. I mean, that sets off his advantage. But with that, and it was not that, it was fairly close last time around, even against, with Brady. And so I can see a lot of, blood in the water sorts of things. I can see a lot of outside money coming in for a race like this with the governor's seat at stake. And so I don't think in the real world, whether it's Rauner or Rutherford, Dillard or Brady, the money will be here. And it's going to be interesting. I mean, as you say, Quinn's just sitting here right now keeping his powder dry. He has the ball and chain, so to speak, of incumbency to deal with. Rauner, if it's him, he doesn't have that, but he's got, the seasoning question is there. Can he hasn't really been there. And Rutherford, I think, is more of a known quantity, so to speak. I mean, he's been under that microscope for enough years. He's a fairly well-known quantity. But I think, come March 19th, it's going to be very interesting. Roll forward to November.
Ray, you had a reporter in on the forum that was going on in the suburbs today. What was your takeaway, looking at how things went?
Yeah, Monique Garcia, actually at Monique Garcia is a great place to check because she had done an amazing job on Twitter. You could get it point by point, and it's still up there on Twitter if you want to see how it really played out. But it really did look like a gang up on Brucey, to borrow his term. And beat up on Brucey, and I think that's a new hashtag. And really, you can see why. Everybody else wants to score points by knocking him down, and they also want to knock him down to a level where they can get up at least close to him, so they can be within striking distance. Monique had written, God bless her, she was up there at that 7 or 8 o'clock forum in Mount Prospect. She had written that this was really a case where they had lobbed everything they had at Rauner, and they're trying to see what sticks.
And he's standing still. I mean,
yeah.
So he passed at least.
Yeah, and he didn't even do, he didn't do himself any favors with that quip either.
So, it wasn't Squeezy the python.
Yeah, right.
Well, there's more of these forums scheduled throughout the state, but Kirk Dillard, for one, has complained that Bruce Rauner is not willing to sign on to even more of them. Do you think we'll see him participating in more of these, or is he just going to stick to, I think 4 is what he's said he wants to do?
Well, he was a late comer on this one, so Dillard even said, hey, glad to see you could make it. Yeah, right. So it was, I think you'll see him sign on if he thinks he needs to. And maybe he'll just be a late comer whenever he wants to, just to see what kind of atmosphere is out there and whether he thinks he needs to pick up some points.
What's the undecided is just still greater than 50%.
Yeah.
It's huge. And I think it's actually gotten bigger in the last couple of months.
It's gone up and down, and you can see why. There is not enough of a message out there except for Rauner and his ads, and more people should be reading the reports from Jamey and Bruce, and hopefully me too, and really, they need to get educated on these kind of things. Quinn also is one of these guys who's going to be a fighter here. So it's not like you put up a candidate here and it's going to be a Republican win. Quinn will not let that happen without going in for a fight. And he's shown before that when he is down, he can come back.
Absolutely. I mean, this does seem to be the time of year heading into the new year when folks are really starting to, the primary's sneaking up on everyone, and they start saying, oh, I better pay attention to what's going on.
Right, that's exactly it. I mean, the holidays were going on. Why should we be worrying about who's going to be the next governor of Illinois when the major election's not until next November? So people aren't tuned in. I can see why.
Well, shrinking it back to the local level, Bruce, you're covering a sheriff's race here in Springfield area that's drawn a lot of attention as far as local races go. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the first time, I'm trying to think of the last time we had a contested Republican primary for sheriff. I don't know that it hasn't been at least since 1990. Because Sheriff Williamson, the incumbent, was elected in 1994. He did not have an opponent in the primary, so far as I know. So it's uncharted territory, so to speak. I mean, the incumbent sheriff is retiring, Sheriff Williamson. He's never, to my knowledge, had a close election. He's proven extremely popular with the electorate, which is kind of what makes this race somewhat curious. His handpicked successor, Jack Campbell, I think has a real tough battle on his hands, and that's seen just if through nothing else, through the fundraising. Again, everything goes back to the fundraising. But the challenger, West Barr, the numbers just came in last night. I looked at them this morning, and West Barr has continued to raise more money than Jack Campbell here. And West Barr is a retired sheriff's lieutenant. The adage is this would never have happened 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I mean, the party was different then, and West Barr would have said, or one of the two would have been said, no, it's not your time, you're going to stand down. And so it's essentially, even though you've got two challengers, it really is as close as you can get to a run to an incumbent in office, because Mr. Campbell has been running the sheriff's office for the last 6 years. He is the de facto sheriff. There hasn't been a lot of attention, in my opinion, paid to some of the nitty-gritty issues here. There are no shortage of issues here. I mean, you've got a tremendous amount of litigation that's going on against the sheriff's office. The legal bills are into the several millions of dollars for pending cases. In fact, they've just had to go out and issue a bond to get money for more legal expenses for the county. A large part of that is because of what's happening in the sheriff's office. So you've got that issue. You've got issues of taserings. That's been oftentimes an issue in the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office. You've got health care in the jail. That's a huge issue. Nobody's talking about that. They're talking about, well, you know, if I'm elected sheriff, I'm going to forego my pension. Or if I'm elected sheriff, I am going to forego this stipend. I mean, we're nibbling around the edges here, I think, in terms of the nitty-gritty of how an office is run, some of the major issues. And that's not necessarily surprising. The challenger, Wes Barr, has been very well known to the community. He's a longtime volunteer for Toys for Tots, Habitat for Humanity, was first citizen by the State Journal-Register, voted Volunteer of the Year 4 times by readers of Illinois Times. So he's got a lot of community support. He's been active politically for several years here, and this was all aimed, the common wisdom is, toward this run. And so he's taken it very seriously. Jack Campbell, again, is kind of saddled in some respects by the burdens of incumbency, but doesn't seem to be enjoying the fruits of them either, which is because the support he's been getting from Sheriff Williamson, which is unequivocal, has not been translating into dollars into his campaign war chest. Williamson himself only has but it has a relatively small amount left in his campaign war chest. I believe it's under $5,000, and that's not going to put Mr. Campbell over the hump. My suspicion is that money's going to go to Mr. Campbell, because what you can do with your campaign funds are limited if you're not going to run again. In fact, Williamson, I think, could keep it, because his dates back far enough but it's a negligible amount. And so I expect it's going to be a very close race. I was chatting with the party chairwoman a few days ago, and she's not supposed to tell me who she's going to vote for, who she thinks she's going to win. But this was Rosemary Long. She sounded genuinely flummoxed. I think this is just a very uncharted territory for him. Andy Van Meter, the party, who's often seen as the de facto head of the party in Sangamon County, has been donating to Mr. Campbell, which that just showed up in the last quarter. I think $5,000, a fairly, for a local race, a fairly good chunk. And so I'm seeing names in the Republican Party that are going for either candidate. It's not like there's no party machinery and everybody's free to support who they want. It's like this free-for-all brouhaha in a Republican primary in Sangamon County. It's kind of interesting to watch.
Well, this also is a situation where it's the first big election here that we've seen since Bill Cellini went to prison too.
True.
A big operator in the Republican Party in Sangamon County too.
Yeah, and you've seen Tony Libri, the party chairman, deposed. Essentially, there's been a perception, at least, of not rudderless ship is probably too strong, but a party in transition. Let's put it that way. That hasn't really got its sea legs yet. And will it ever be the party it once was under folks like Cellini and Irv Smith? I mean, they were the kingmakers, so to speak. They decided who was going to run, and that's certainly no longer the case. And this race is proving it.
Well, and real quick at the end here, Bruce, you're also covering a judicial issue that has to do with access to records that was really interesting and could have effect on folks across the state, right?
Yeah, this is actually about public records, but this one I particularly like because I think it's a story about, I'll say it's somewhat pulling off a fast one. The state legislature a couple of years ago, there was a bill up for that affected the state appellate prosecutor's office. And of course it has to have something to do with the legislature. Yeah, of course it has to have something to do with the legislature. And so it says, well, the appellate prosecutor's office isn't, their investigators are going to consist of the state police. They're going to use the state police for their investigators. And we're going to change a few of the procedures for procurement practices. Very, as nuts and bolts. Yeah, as nuts and bolts, as simple and innocuous as you could possibly imagine. Slipped into it, however, was a change in the definition of the office. It's called the State Appellate Prosecutor's Office, an office of the judiciary. which is, it clearly is not in our adversarial system of jurisprudence. It's anything but. But the legislature unanimously decreed that the state appellate prosecutor's office is a body of the judiciary. It was passed the House unanimously. It passed the Senate unanimously. It was signed into law by the governor almost instantaneously with the provision that it take effect immediately. Well, what this bill was really about was exempting prosecutors from the Freedom of Information Act in Illinois, because the Freedom of Information Act has always been decreed to apply to perhaps some state, the public bodies are bodies of the state, bodies of local government, but not the judiciary. The courts have always been different, and for good reason. I mean, you don't want folks being able to look into the records of judges and how they might make certain decisions. And sometimes you might, but on the whole, you don't. So, at any rate, the practical effect has been the courts have now been holding that prosecutors in Illinois are offices of the judiciary and therefore exempt from the State Freedom of Information Act. And the other prong that this rests on is that the same article of the Constitution that created the judiciary also created a state appellate prosecutor, not appellate prosecutors, but state's attorneys. And there have been 2 court decisions now that have said that prosecutors, in fact, they might sound like prosecutors, but in fact they're judges for purposes of requesting records. So all this comes to a head on January 23rd with a hearing before the state Supreme Court. The last judge to weigh in on the Fourth Circuit, the Fourth. I always get it screwed up. The Fourth. Yeah. Thank you so much. They described the legislature's actions that they remind them of a story of Abraham Lincoln once asked somebody, if you call the tail of a dog a leg, how many legs does a dog have? And the guy says, well, 5. And Lincoln says, well, no, it was just because you call a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. And so that's the same thing that the legislature has done here. Just because you call a prosecutor a judge doesn't make him so. But the only reason that they could discern was, in fact, to exempt them. And so it'll be interesting to see how I'll be going to the hearing. I don't know if I'm going to report on it, but it should be, so far the briefs have been more amusing than most to read. And so I'm looking forward to this one.
Well, of course, keep it secret if you can. That's what they want to do.
And we're going to have to leave it at that. But Bruce, I hope you can come back and tell us more about that whenever that is resolved or whenever things pan out, because it's a really interesting topic. But we'll cover that and more issues when you tune in next week for Capitol View. I'd like to thank my guests, Ray Long and Bruce Rushton, and I'm your host, Jamey Dunn. Thank you for tuning in.